halkani waa RTN.
Assalamu alaikum viewers, welcome to Talking Point. I'm your host Abdi Ahmed Abdullahi and my guest today is PLO Lumumba. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Professor, on 1st September and 20th November, I mean these are 2 days that will go down the annal of the history of this country. As one day the Supreme Court annulled the election of a president, and the other day the Supreme Court upheld the election of the same president. Where does this place our judiciary?
I believe that the judiciary acts on the basis of the evidence that is put before it, but I hold the view that in choosing to annul the elections on the first day of September by a majority of 4-2, the Supreme Court was wrong. In my view, and I participated in that trial, there was no reason at all that justified the nullification of the election. I hold the view the minority decision as rendered by Justice Professor Juang and Joki Ndungu represents the right law. And if you care to have a conversation with very many sober-minded jurisprudents around the world and around Africa who have read the judgment, they hold the view that I do. But be that as it may, the judiciary then ordered that the elections be held within 60 days. And the elections were held by the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, and on the 26th we had an election. And that election was pursuant to a court order. One of the candidates chose to withdraw, but did not withdraw in accordance with the law. He simply made statements that he had withdrawn.
What do you mean he did not withdraw according to the law?
The law prescribes the manner in which you withdraw from an electoral process. It says that you must fill a form, and once you fill that form, you submit it to the IEBC. He did not, Mr. Raila Odinga. With the consequence that his name remained on the ballot because he had not withdrawn in accordance with the law. That is the position. His party, of course, and his supporters did not then participate in the election, and some were intimidated not to participate in the election. You'll remember what happened in Nyanza, particularly in the 4 counties in what is sometimes referred to as Luo Nyanza. There were barricades everywhere. The IEBC was prevented from delivering the election material, so that when I hear people say people did not vote voluntarily, we must never forget that many were intimidated not to vote. And that was not only in Nyanza, that happened in certain areas, even in Nairobi, which is areas which are largely populated by the supporters of that candidate, Mr. Raila Odinga. So we've got to see these things in context. In other words, we've got to ask ourselves, did the people have the freedom to vote in those areas that they did not? The answer is no, they did not. But even if they did not, others chose to vote, and the process went through, and it is instructive that the Honorable the Chief Justice of the Republic of Kenya went to his rural home and voted. And of course, there is also a declared, and Mr. Kenyatta was declared as the winner. And in my view, it demonstrates, this time round, it is instructive that the Supreme Court did not want the servers opened, they did not want all these things, because they could see, in my view, that the decision that was made on the first day of September was not made properly.
But Professor, some quarters have it that the decision that was made on 20th of November was born of, the country being in a pull and push mood. I mean, the economy almost coming to a halt. Is like to mechoka, let's just have someone to rule us. Do you buy that?
No, I don't. These are self-serving arguments by individuals who, when things happen the way they want, it is fine. When they don't happen the way they want, it is not fine. What was the difference? In the month of September, the country's economy was suffering because of these frequent riots. So I want to give credit to the judiciary that having examined the evidence that was placed before them, they arrived at a decision which was correct, which is what I think they ought to have arrived at on the first day of September. But unfortunately, when they were arriving at this decision, on the 20th day of November, it is after lives had been lost. It is after property in the billions had been lost. It is after pain had been borne by the country. We would have saved ourselves a lot had the correct decision, in my view, been made on the first day of September. And see, I keep on saying, in my view, to demonstrate that my view is not necessarily the view that is held by everybody else. And I respect other people's views, but that does not mean that I do not hold a view.
Professor, you were in the same courtroom in the Supreme Court on 1st September when one of the lawyers of the president, Ahmed Nasir Abdullahi, said the decision that the majority have reached has political intonations.
Yes.
How did you receive those words?
Well, my good friend Ahmed Nasir has his entitlement to his view. He took the view. Remember that he was representing the president in that petition. I was part of the team representing the IEBC. So our approach was very technical. But representing the president as he did, I kind of understand where he was coming from. That in that particular case, the results were that President Kenyatta had received the majority of the votes. One would have liked the court to order that the votes be actually counted one by one. Instead, they sought refuge in something called the server, as if the will of the people resides in the server. The will of the people does not reside in the server. The will of the people resides in the individual ballots. And those were not counted. And I could understand the pain of his clients as expressed through him, that there was an element of political correctness. That was his view. My view is that the majority in that decision did not apply themselves and their minds to the law as tested against the facts that were before them, and that in my view, as I've said before, it is the minority in the decision that did apply the proper test.
Professor Lumumba, let's come to Tuesday of last week when the president was being sworn in. How did you welcome his speech?
President Kenyatta's speech was wide-ranging. He covered a number of things. Remember that he went into history. He said how the institutions of this country have been tested over the years. He talked about the tests that we had in 1982 when there was an attempt to remove the government of the Republic of Kenya unlawfully. He talked about the events of the year 2007 when the country nearly went into civil war. He talked about the pain that had been suffered for nearly 120 days as we waited for the court's decision and his ultimate swearing in as the President of the Republic of Kenya. But then he said that all that done, his understanding of his renewed mandate is to unite the country as a priority, because he appreciated that the country is polarized. And I think that that is the right approach. Beyond the boundaries of Kenya, he also reiterated the fact that we as a country must be governed by the rule of law in the manner that he himself had chosen to follow the decisions of the court to the letter. He also, of course, did not stop there. He went to East Africa and said that there was need for East Africans to work as a team. And that is how I understood him in making the pronouncement that non-Kenyans will now receive visas on arrival, and that East Africans will be treated as if they were Kenyans, subject to Kenyan law.
Hold your thoughts, Professor,
yes,
on that. When you open up the borders, when you say that free on arrival, I mean, we have neighbors who are very, their homes or their houses, like South Sudan, Somalia, I mean, a bit shaky. Don't you think this is posing a security risk?
Let me put this in context. Kenya is not the first country to say what President Kenyatta said.
Oh, really?
Ghana has done that. Rwanda has done that. I think Nigeria has also done that. So that it is not as if we are the first country in the world. But the other thing that we must remember, when somebody says that you gain a visa upon entry, it doesn't mean that the rules of issuing visa have been thrown overboard. It simply means that instead of applying at home, you come to the port of entry and you'll be subjected to the same criteria that is issued to other visa holders. And that those who do not deserve entry in the Republic of Kenya will be subjected to the rules that are prescribed or enacted by the Kenyan legislature. What that means, therefore, is that we are making it easier for responsible people to get into the Republic of Kenya. And you will know that when a president of a country gives a speech, those are broad policy statements. It is out of that speech that a policy position will then be adopted. The policy position will then be cascaded into legislation and necessary regulations. It is not as if he's giving an order ex cathedra or a dictate. It must be converted into law.
Professor Lumumba, my understanding is this.
Yes.
That if someone from Bundubujo, someone, let's say in Western Uganda, or someone from Mbeya, Southern Tanzania, can come to this country, get married, that's according to my president. Does that also imply that the offspring are entitled to free education in this country? That
is a debate. Those are the kind of things that I say you cannot pick out of a speech such as that. I'm quite certain, like happens in all governments, the president has made a pronouncement. I'm sure he made it after consultation, because the statement and the speech is written on the basis of consultation from different government departments. But even if he did not go into details, as he cannot in a speech, when he gets it down to operationalization, all those issues will now be considered, that if you are a citizen of East Africa, these are your entitlements. In any event, why should that be strange? Isn't that the spirit of the East African community, that ultimately will become one country? Isn't that the spirit of the East African community, that we have free movement of goods and services? Is it not the case in Rwanda as we speak, that East Africans can work in Rwanda without work permits? So that there is nothing spectacularly new that President Kenyatta is saying that has not been done by other African countries such as Rwanda and Ghana, as I've said, and much more recently Nigeria. But in the nature of things, guidelines will be issued and the laws will be enacted and or amended to ensure that the security concerns and all those other considerations that come into play are communicated to those who are the target audience in a manner that is understandable.
Still on the speech, the president said, I repeat, there will be no elections. That's within this 5-year period. We have NASA, you know, they have come up with a 6-member committee spearheaded by David Ndii. I mean, to be headed by David Ndii on issues elections. What does that tell you?
You know, I've learned not to rely too much on sensational newspaper headlines, because newspaper headlines sometimes are sensational for purposes of getting the buyers to buy it. I've seen that report in the Standard of the 2nd day of December. I've not seen similar sensation in the
Nation. The Daily Nation.
It is in the Daily Nation, but not with the kind of sensation that you see in the Standard. So I would want to see the terms of reference of that body. What are they trying to do? Are they looking at elections in the future? Are they looking at the Constitution for the future? Are they looking at the circumstances that attended this election with a view to informing their instructing authority what to do about it? Those are the things that I would not want to speak to. But I am very reluctant and very slow to say that that body is preparing for some election, because before you begin or purport to be preparing for Kenyan election, the question that I would ask, on the basis of what law have you been appointed? You've been appointed as a party organ. That the party is entitled to do what they have done. They can put together experts to advise them on the position to take, and that is within their remit as a political party. But that does not concern the Republic of Kenya. The Republic of Kenya has the Constitution and other laws that tells us which body is mandated to organize and to conduct election, and that body is the IEBC.
Okay.
Yes.
Professor, you mentioned that what you read from the speech of the president is this country is polarized.
Yes.
Now, according to your thoughts, how best are structures to be put for dialogue, and who should initiate the dialogue?
He who is in a position of authority normally takes the initiative. And I think there is a sense in which President Kenyatta said this. He said that I want as my legacy a united Kenya. And I've already started reaching out to other individuals in the political arena whom he described as his worthy opponents. One would assume that the deliberate efforts will then be made by the president through his other functionaries to get in touch with other political players. In an orderly society, it is parliament that is the forum for such dialogue. But if you want extra parliamentary dialogue, which is what I hear some calling for, you can also initiate it. Okay. But what prevents the Kenyan parliament, as presently constituted, remember there are representatives from both government and the opposition, to have a parliamentary committee that will deal with the question of dialogue, both in the National Assembly and in the Senate, because that would be the orderly way of conducting such dialogue. And in any event, even when you dialogue, you must identify what are the issues that we are dealing with. How significant are they to the nation? And some of the issues that are being brought about is that some areas of the country have been marginalized. Let us flag that as an issue. Indeed, our own constitution does recognize that there are areas of the country that have been marginalized, and that is why we have a specific fund that deals with such issues. And if we think marginalization is an issue, we flag it as an agenda item. If we think that there are certain aspects of our constitution that need to be examined, we also look at those issues. If we think that there are certain aspects of the electoral law that need to be amended going forward, then those are the issues that ought to be dealt with. I remember at one time, I think in 1997, that there was the inter-parties parliamentary group, which I think is the kind of thing that was led at that time by my very good friend Gilo Falana. That is the kind of initiative that I would want to see across the aisle, so that people begin to negotiate within the confines of constitutional structures.
But Professor, the opposition is already saying that the window for dialogue is already closed.
I think that is political grandstanding. When you are talking about the life of a country, the window for negotiation can never be closed. It is closed so that we do what? So that we go to war and then negotiate after? The window for dialogue can never, ever be closed in any country throughout the world. We see the conflicts that are much more pernicious, such as in Syria. Do you hear them saying that the window for dialogue is closed? Do you hear even in countries such as Yemen, people saying that dialogue is closed? The window for dialogue is always open. That is why we have parliament. Parliament is a forum for perpetual dialogue on the state of the nation. So when I hear people make such statements, they are statements which are designed to, they are sound bites which are meant to capture newspaper headlines and one-line quotes in the radio and television. But I don't think they mean them. So if it is true that they are closed, then what do they want to do? Do they want to mount a guerrilla warfare? Do they want to take the government over by force? That is what you do. When you say that the space for dialogue is closed, then you take the government by force.
Professor, 12th of December, Raila Odinga has come out so clearly saying that he's going to be sworn in. How is he going to be sworn in?
First of all, let us ask ourselves, is he the first leader in Africa to say that he'll be sworn in? Or the first one to be sworn in, if he's sworn in at all? He will not be the first. Etienne Tshisekedi swore himself in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Kiza Besigye swore himself in the neighborhood in Uganda. You can swear yourself in, but is it in accordance with the Constitution? Is it in accordance with the law? Once you've sworn yourself in, you are commander-in-chief of which forces? You preside over which government, which civil service? You collect your revenue from where? You issue your orders from where? How will you give effect to those orders? So I want to imagine that good counsel will prevail and that the threat to swear oneself in is merely a means of making the stakes go higher so that you can get to the negotiating table. Because if you swear yourself in, that is a treasonable act, particularly if it is read together with some of the activities that you have already pronounced, for example, that you are boycotting certain things so that you can sabotage the economy. What you are saying is that you want to bring the government of the Republic of Kenya as legally constituted down, and that is classical treason. So I want to believe that that will not happen and that good counsel will prevail.
Professor, so far, what do you make of the economic boycotts spearheaded by NASA?
I think nothing has happened. I talked to quite a number of my friends who are in NASA, and they are using their Safaricom lines.
Sure.
Yeah, many of them. So this idea, this is grandstanding. They may have bought a second line, which is Airtel. But even if you boycott, who suffers? Because even if you are to buy Airtel line, Airtel still pays taxes to the Republic of Kenya. So who loses? If you boycott Bidco products and you buy other products other than Bidco, you are still paying taxes to the Republic of Kenya. You know, some of these things that I see being implemented by my very good friends on the other side of the political divide, which is NASA, are copied from the 1960 civil rights movements by Martin Luther King Jr. But it is a complete misunderstanding of what was happening during the civil rights movement.
Okay.
In the civil rights movement, during the bus boycotts, the buses were owned by whites. And therefore, if you boycotted them, there was a direct impact on those who are the owners of the buses. And they look very nice when you say them on the newspaper, but the truth is that, in my view, it is individuals who may have suffered, particularly in areas where they may face hostility. Some woman or some young man who was selling Safaricom may now be fearful that they will be attacked or invaded. But for the economy, what has happened, this thing, what it has done to the economy is that it has made very many potential investors postpone their investment decisions. And some of them may have chosen to go to Uganda, Rwanda, or Tanzania. And that is what one may be worried about. But as far as the individual companies are concerned, Safaricom is too big to be shaken by this kind of political shenanigans.
Well, you're watching Talking Point. I'm Abdi Ahmed Abdullahi together with Professor PLO Lumumba. Professor, with a bias to his legacy, what should we expect in terms of the new cabinet and plum government jobs from President Uhuru?
First of all, it must also be recognized that the last administration of President Kenyatta was not inclusive.
Was not?
Was not.
Okay.
There is a sense in which the running of the government was seen, and rightly so in quite a number of cases, to favor certain communities who are predominantly in the Jubilee arrangement. I think that is what he must repair. What he must do is to put together a government that will be seen symbolically to represent the faces of the Republic of Kenya. And the other thing that I think must happen is that deliberate efforts must be made to ensure that those who feel left out are brought into government through economic intervention. You know, appointments of individuals in and of itself does not solve the problem. Those are merely symbolic. But I would want President Kenyatta to ask the question that President Museveni asked in Uganda. Why is it that the people of northern Uganda, who are the Acholi and the Langi, are constantly hostile to my government? Why is it that the Karamoja are constantly hostile to my government? And what President Museveni did was to appoint a specific minister for Karamoja, his own wife, Janet Museveni, was to make a deliberate effort to run government for some time from Gulu in northern Uganda, and to make deliberate economic intervention so that the economy of that area can be revived. I want to see President Kenyatta making a deliberate effort to focus on Luo Nyanza specifically, because it feels aggrieved. It feels aggrieved because their sugar industry is long dead. It feels aggrieved because the fishing industry is nothing to write home about. It feels aggrieved because the cotton industry is dead. It feels aggrieved because the lake is not being utilized as it ought to be. He has a duty as the President of the Republic of Kenya to work with the counties in that area, the county governments in that area, to identify the priorities and ensure the government injects money in that area. And that is not the only area that he should look at. He should look at the Coast Province and ask the people in Coastal Province, what is your grievance? If it is land, how are we going to deal with it? If it is a question of the resources, if it is titanium, if it is sugar, and all those things, how can we address it in a manner that the people will feel that the government cares about them? If it is northeastern Kenya, they should ask a similar question. In other words, this is the opportunity for President Kenyatta to make deliberate efforts to ensure that every section of Kenya feels that they are part of the country. So that this talk of secession, it is one that is being propagated specifically by politicians, and politicians can be a danger to a country. Politicians who are looking for short-term political gains can go to any lengths. And it is only later that you realize that you are led up the garden path. I personally hold the view that this country has problems which can be solved within the territory of Kenya. Devolution started doing that. If the devolution has not achieved it in the manner that we want, we can have a look at devolution again and improve it to ensure that that is achieved. We have seen this thing called secession is not taken lightly in countries. We saw recently in Spain when the Catalans thought that they could secede. The Madrid government came down on them like a ton of bricks. Exactly. When the Kurds voted in favor of secession, you saw how the Iraqi government came down on them like a ton of bricks, and so did the Turkish government. We have seen in the recent past when the Northern Irish attempted to secede, we saw how the British government came on them like a ton of bricks. Much more earlier in history, we saw when the southern part of the United States of America wanted to secede, how the central government in Washington came against them like a ton of bricks. So when people talk about secession in this very flippant manner, they think that that is going to solve the problem. And who tells them that this new republic that they are creating, and let me be blunt about them, who tells you that the Luhya will want to be in the same state with the Luos 5 years down the line? Who tells you that the Mijikenda will want to be with the Kambas 10 years down the line? As Mwalimu Nyerere used to say, if you start the process of negotiation, of secession, you will discover that you will dismember your country into little pieces which you cannot recognize. All those problems can be discussed as a people of Kenya, and we have a perfect opportunity to discuss them now.
Professor, you've put it that they're bringing the whole thing in a very flippant way.
Yes.
But what really makes them talk like this on secession? Because even the president in his speech, he talked about the shifter secession in the 1964. And we overcame it. That's what, according to the words of the president. Yeah. But exactly, why is this talk coming now?
You know, and I'm going to be seen as unfair in this regard. We have created an environment in this country, and not only in this country, it appears to be an African problem, that losers don't accept they have lost elections, and that elections are only deemed to be free and fair when you win them. Let me give you, of course I'll be accused of many things by those who don't share my view, but this is my view. We saw this in Mozambique. The losers did not concede. We have seen this in Zambia in the recent past. We have seen it in Angola. We have seen it in Nigeria, we have seen it in Gabon, we have seen it in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have seen it in Sudan, we have seen it in Uganda, we have seen it in Kenya, we have seen it in Tanzania, we have seen it in Burundi. In other words, there appears to be a problem in Africa that we have no culture of accepting electoral loss, so that if you lose, the elections have been rigged. And I think that this is one of the major agenda items that must be on the table if we as a country choose to dialogue. Why is it that we only accept institutions as working when they make decisions that are in our favor? Allow me. When the Supreme Court nullified the elections in Kenya, the entire NASA brigade said the judiciary has now redeemed itself. They have now demonstrated that they are different from other judiciaries in the world. On the other hand, Jubilee was busy insulting the judiciary as having arrived at a decision which was unfavorable and completely ungoverned by law.
Exactly.
On the 20th of November, the Jubilee supporters were in praise of Justice Maraga and his court, and indeed on the 28th, when he arrived at the stadium, he received a hero's welcome. On the other hand, NASA was saying he was intimidated into giving this judgment. You can see. But look at countries that have matured, such as the United States of America. Trump wins the electoral vote. Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote. She's so gracious in defeat. And she says, I have lost. The people of America, as governed by the law of the United States of America, as it is today, have spoken. I concede defeat, and makes a phone call to Donald Trump. You never see that in Africa. And one of the few examples that we would have seen was in Gambia, where Yahya Jammeh conceded defeat. After 1 week, he says, no, I was wrong. I actually did win the election. So there appears to be a problem in Africa. And it's a problem that we as a country must address. It is a problem that possibly the African Union must address, to find why is it that we in this continent are incapable of conducting elections that are acceptable to the winners and the losers, however painful. If we don't, we are going to have major crises going forward.
And Professor, when do you think we Africans will talk like the way Hillary talked to Trump, that, okay, yeah, you're the big man?
You know, the problem in this part of the world is that people invest in this electoral process emotionally and financially, so that when you see people are pained in the manner that they are, it is involved and informed, it is informed by this emotional investment. Because people believe that we as a population will only benefit if one of our own is the president. So that if a Kamba is the president, that is the only time that the Kambas will feel that we now own the government. If a Luo is a president, that is the only time that the Luos will feel that we are in part of the government. If the Kikuyu and the Kalenjin, and we must liberate ourselves from those jingoistic, narrow ethnic thoughts. What we want at the helm are men and women who have been chosen through a democratic process and will preside over the country in a manner that is for the benefit of all. I can say for myself that I have long liberated myself from such thoughts. It doesn't matter to me who is the president of the Republic of Kenya, what his ethnic extraction is. I don't care. What I want is that that individual has been elected in accordance with the law in an electoral process that is free and fair, and that he governs us in accordance with the law and ensures that all of us have the opportunity to serve in our different capacities. That is what we must do. Easier said than done. Because as Koigi Mwere says in his books towards genocide in Kenya, the curse of negative ethnicity, these ethnic leaders create the impression to those whom they lead that our life will only begin when I am the president, and that if one of your own is not the president, then you cannot thrive. We must liberate ourselves from such primitive thoughts. They are primitive thoughts. There is no other word. I tried to look for a better, less harsh word, but I couldn't get it.
Professor, people are already talking about the succession of 2022. For how long does this country stand this perceived notion of being in election mode immediately after polls are closed?
It is very sad. When I listen to people, the president has barely settled in office. And people are beginning to talk about the election that are due in the year 2022. And President Museveni, in his very short address, told Kenyans, please, you cannot be in a perpetual electioneering mood. And this has been going on since the year 1992. We are perpetually campaigning. We are perpetually in an electioneering mood. I think it is very sad. I think as a country, we must make a decision that we must allow a new administration to govern. And all this political talk must stop until possibly a year to the election. Otherwise, right now, new and fresh emotions have started emerging. And once again, they are emerging out of an ethnic kind of cocoon. People are saying, how can it be a ping pong game? You see, you've had that kind of debate. That is now, and let me be blunt about, that the presidency of the Republic of Kenya is going to be a ping pong game between the Kikuyu of Kenya and the Kalenjin of Kenya. And you don't want that kind of discussion. You want the country to go into a process of governance and making everybody feel, and people will then offer themselves for the elections when they come in the year 2022, and people will be elected on the basis of the agenda that they want to offer to the people of Kenya. It is a sad thing indeed.
Professor, on a Friday when Raila Odinga came back from the United States, things were very bad in this country. Chaos reigned in Nairobi. People talked of police brutality. The president has given the police officers clean bill of health. What is your take?
First of all, before I answer that question, if I was in government, I would have allowed Raila supporters to meet him.
Okay.
Of course, I personally think that Raila ought to have organized it differently. I think that he would have allowed a small group to meet him at the airport, and then he joins them at Uhuru Park and whichever venue. Once again, even the meeting at Jacaranda, which I think was ill-advised, I think that Mr. Odinga should have organized the occasion on a different date. But having chosen to organize it on that day, once again, if I was in government, I would have allowed him to hold it. But we must also remember, and I was myself, my car was towed as I was going to the airport on that day.
Sorry.
And there is a sense in which we must blame both parties.
Okay.
The police for using deadly force in certain circumstances, but even those who are involved in the demonstration. I saw for myself when our cars were being stoned in an area where there were no policemen at all. The individuals were just stoning everybody on sight. It is incumbent upon leaders when they organize protests to ensure that they are there, complete with their own marshals. Because we are saying that we are involved in civil disobedience. If you look at classical civil disobedience as organized by Martin Luther King Jr., they always led, they were always on foot with the marchers, leading from the front to ensure that there will be discipline throughout the process. When Martin Luther King Jr. was organizing the Washington March, he was in front with Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, and everybody, Ralph Abernathy, he was in front. When Mahatma Gandhi was organizing the march to make salt on the Indian Ocean, he was in front. But we have leaders here who are in cars, on top of cars, they are not there. Once you do that, you succeed in exciting mobs. And once you excite mobs, then you create a situation where it degenerates into chaos. But going forward, myself, and as I've said, if I was in government, we should re-examine how crowds are controlled. And this is one area where I think we are not doing a very good job. We are not, and public meetings, particularly in a charged political environment, should not be licensed in areas where there is a large population. because the dangers are very real, as we have seen. You should organize such functions in places such as Uhuru Park, such as Nyayo Stadium, such as Kasarani, and I think it is time for the government and the police to designate areas which will be utilized for public assembly and not in populated areas, so that we save our young men and women and the little people whose lives have been lost for no reason at all.
Professor, there is this talk about the People's Assembly.
There is a bit of your question that I must answer. You say that the President Kenyatta has commended the police,
giving them
a clean bill of health. Remember that the President Kenyatta is the head of these disciplined forces, and in the midst of all these attacks and accusations, I think he's simply trying to give them confidence. But that does not take away that IPOA, the Independent Policing Authority, has already instituted investigations, and that other institutions created by the Constitution have already instituted investigation, so that if it is found, as a matter of fact, on the basis of the evidence that is available, that any police officer used a firearm in a situation where he or she ought not have used it, he or she will be dealt with in accordance with the law. But he's simply saying that as your leader, as the person who is head of this government, I want to reassure you that despite all the things that are being said, I still have confidence in you.
Professor, in the circles of NASA, there is this talk about People's Assembly. Can you really break it down for us and how it's grounded in law?
You know, I've tried to read the Constitution, and I'm a good student of the Constitution, and I've been a teacher of the Constitution, and I've tried and was involved in the process of making this Constitution. There is a reference to that sovereignty belongs to the people. It is true that sovereignty belongs to the people, and that in representative democracy you then proceed to vest that power in recognized institutions institutions recognized by law. In this regard, the institutions that are recognized by law include the National Assembly, include the Senate, include the judiciary, include the executive arm of government, that is at the central government. When you go down to the 47 counties, they recognize the county assembly, they recognize the office of the governor, and they recognize his cabinet as constituted. However elastic you want to expand this constitution, I cannot understand the constitutional basis that a county assembly sits and says that we are creating another rival organ called the People's Assembly. Which people? Who has given you the mandate? Did the people give you the mandate to create another organ to do what?
So, Professor, you mean these 10 counties are all wrong?
Of course. In my view, I have no doubt in my mind that those bodies are completely unconstitutional. How will they be funded? It is you and me as the taxpayers who are funding these bodies. Exactly. Some organ is creating additional bodies which will be funded by who? When we are drawing our budget, how will we describe these bodies? Who are going to be the members of this body? I hear it being said that it's going to be the people. How will those people be elected? It's going to have trade unionists. How are those trade unionists going to be elected? And they remember that trade unions are politically neutral, that they are going to be religious leaders. Which ones? The Catholics, the Anglicans, the Muslims, and the NGOs. Who are they? NGOs have specific mandate. They are in health and in environment. So how are you going to populate this People's Assembly? And once they have been constituted and they make their decisions, how will they implement those decisions? And how will those decisions affect the people of Kenya who did not participate in creating them? But I know what is being done. What is being done is not new. In 1992, in the country of Benin, when the president was very unpopular, the opposition created something of this nature, and ultimately it met in Cotonou, and it led to the dissolution of parliament, and it led to the creation of a government of national unity. I know, and I can describe the creation of these particular bodies is in the nature of a coup d'etat in slow motion. So you don't want to mount a coup d'etat in the classical way of using the armed forces or being a guerrilla movement. So you appear to be walking on the fringes of the law so that you create mass discontent in the country and you create a situation where there is a popular revolt. It is something that has been done before in Benin, and I think that is what we are trying to, that is what NASA is trying to do in Kenya.
And finally, Professor, can we really separate politics and justice in this country?
You know, justice according to law, we must always be clear that when we talk about justice, it must be justice according to law. Exactly. Because justice in the broader sense is a very wide concept and a very wide word. But justice must be on the basis of the law as it stands today. And I hold the view that it is incumbent upon any government that is in power to exercise that power in a manner that is fair to all. And that requires, among other things, particularly when you are in government, that you must accommodate different views, that you must appreciate what it is that the opposition, for example, is complaining about. I would expect, for example, that in order to ensure that we as a country continue to be a going concern, and I'm surprised that the NASA parliamentarians have not tabled a motion in Parliament to create a special parliamentary committee to discuss all these grievances that they have, because that is what Parliament is for. Why can't they create an inter-parties parliamentary group? Instead, they are looking for extra parliamentary solutions, and yet they are elected as members of Parliament. We elect members of Parliament so that they can sit in Parliament to not only to make law, but to adjudicate over issues which concern us. Instead, they are not using that platform. They are saying, for example, that they are going to stall the president in nominating his members of cabinet. They'll nominate them anyway. Remember that Jubilee has the majority. So what I would expect is, one, that NASA uses its place in Parliament to ensure that the government is kept on its toes. Two, that Jubilee does not use its majority in Parliament in order to create an environment where NASA cannot operate. That both NASA and Jubilee and other political parties also create an environment where we can have an inter-party environment where issues which are of national interest are discussed as such, and partisan political interests are not allowed to stand in the way of those issues. And President Kenyatta, on his part, must go out of his way to bring in all these individuals in politics on a table, not to make them join government, but to have them contribute to governance in Kenya. For example, Mr. Raila Odinga is a major political player in government. Invite him. Mr. Musalia Mudavadi, to the extent that he was at one time a deputy prime minister. Mr. Kalonzo Musyoka. Those are individuals that he can have a conversation with so that he listens to their grievances for the best interest of the country. What Kenyan politicians must remember, whoever they are, is that they are dispensable. None of them is indispensable. Robert Mugabe.
Including Raila?
Oh, including Raila.
Okay.
Including Raila. Why do I say so? Any one of them can die. Who tells them they cannot? And the country will continue. Mugabe, whose freedom fighting credentials you cannot quarrel with, and governed Zimbabwe for 37 years, thought that he was indispensable. Within a week, it was demonstrated to him that Zimbabwe is larger than him. Mobutu thought he was larger than life, almost as large as death. He disappeared. Habre in Chad. There are people who have thought throughout history that they are larger than life, almost as large as death. And history has been consistent in saying that they are merely privileged to have the honor of serving their fellow countrymen and women. Our politicians across the political divide must always remember that.
Professor, briefly, what is your last word on this talk?
My view and my last word is that Kenya is a great country in prospect, but Kenya is undermined every 5 years as a result of elections which are contested by individuals who believe that things must happen in the manner that they desire across the political divide. Time has come that Kenyan politicians must realize that the country is larger than all of them, and that therefore we should use this opportunity that is God-given to enter into useful dialogue to ensure that Kenya never finds herself in a situation where young boys and young girls and adults are dying because of the ambitions of politicians.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your time.
Thank you.
That
Thank you
was
very much.
Professor PLO Lumumba, Director, Kenya School of Law. You've been watching Talking Points. This is Abdi Ahmed Abdullahi. Until next time, keep it RTN.
halkani waa RTN.